On June the 11th, 1981, Issei Sagawa committed one of the most notorious individual crimes of the last 20 years. Unlike most of his kind, society did not exact its revenge. Sagawa was not locked up until, old and grey, he'd emerge into a world where he and his crime had been long forgotten. Due to an extraordinary legal loophole, Sagawa was freed 3 years after the crime. Since committing his crime, Sagawa has written a series of books. In them, he sought to explain, though many would say exploit, the nature of his act. Obsessed by his criminality, these books provide an insight into a world where fantasy leads to obsession, and obsession to compulsion. But faced with a man, one's also faced with one's own incomprehension. After all, once you know what he's done, it's difficult not to recoil. How is it possible for this man to engage in a sequence of logical, sane actions towards an illogical and insane purpose? How could he have led such an outwardly sane life, yet have been mad in his soul? I use a deliberately religious phrase because the shadow of hell has passed through this man's life. Pity the victim. Pity the criminal? Well, maybe, but Sagawa's attempt to explore his actions has led to another extraordinary phenomenon, the cult of the criminal turned celebrity.
I've always felt a sense of loss, a physical sensation of being half-formed, a sense that a part of me, a part of my physical essence was lost. It was something pinkish and soft, but it wasn't blood. My mother's voice comes back clearly. She's in a crowd shopping, heavily pregnant, carrying bags of food for the New Year celebration. She feels a terrible pain. And now she's lying on her back. The faces peer at her. No, you haven't had a miscarriage, you'll be all right. But my mother feels a sense of loss. She puts her hand on the sheet and moves it slowly towards her stomach. It feels smaller now. That was the moment of my loss. Visitors peer at my spindly, shrunken body. My father comes straight from work. He picks me up and places me gently on the palm of his hand. Me, that frail, sentient being, fated to crave the substance I lacked. A year later, my brother was born. We were called the twins, always together, yet so different. He, like other little children, had a roundness and fullness to his body, whilst I, with arms and legs like pencils, had no softness to me. I was all straight lines. When I was 3 or 4, I started to have dreams about being thrown into a pot with my younger brother and boiled. Nightmares triggered by my Uncle Mizo's New Year pantomime. Every year he'd play the cannibal giant. Me and my brother would be the 2 terrified princes. Our faithful knight and protector, my father, would engage the giant in mortal combat. The forces of good and evil battled it out in front of our eyes. First blinded, then stabbed. Our protector lay dead at our feet. And then my brother and I were carried off to the cannibal pot to be boiled alive. Soon this fixation was seeping into my childhood reading, always selected on the basis of my fascination with man-eating giants and devils. When I was in my first year of primary school and changing for PE, I was struck by the difference between my body and other children's. All the other children seemed to have a roundness and fullness to their bodies. I felt that mine was incomplete. That was the first time I thought of myself like that. Over the years, this feeling of incompleteness grew. It became a strong yearning, an overwhelming desire to have what I lacked.
I
found a scarf belonging to one of my school friends. I fell asleep thinking, I must give it back to her tomorrow. And then I hear a voice saying, I will take you to the real world. I opened my eyes and saw a big red heart-shaped gate. I stepped through it and there's fog everywhere. I can't see anything. I keep walking blindly forward, and then I see a dim light up ahead. As I get closer, the light's coming from a young girl's naked body. The light comes from a cage full of them. I look closer. I realize that they're my female school friends. And I hear footsteps behind me. An invisible creature opens the door of the cage and says, whose turn is it to be eaten today? The creature checks each woman. They look at the creature fearfully, and then one who is picked seems unable to cry out. She disappears. I follow the girl and her invisible captor. And then I'm aware of a smell. It's delicious and revolting at the same time. I'm standing in front of the closed door of the kitchen. The smell is coming from there. I open the door and I look inside. What are you doing? I shout. The monster turns round and says, but I am you.
Yet, here he was, surrounded by a loving family, a successful and proud father, adoring mother, a clever, delicate young man, yet haunted by a fantasy life that was almost as ludicrous as it was shameful. Inevitably, in his teenage years, he didn't know how to deal with his own desires. In his books, he describes how his fantasies became locked into his sexuality, and as his sexuality developed, so did his fantasies, but in a setting that was utterly incongruous.
During the university summer holidays, a friend of mine invited me to stay in his house for a week. There was a young American woman staying there too, the first I'd seen, the first I got close to. And I got on well with her, and we started talking. And as I talked to her, I felt something opening up inside me. We all went down to the beach. I saw her whole body in a bikini. We went into the water, and I dived underneath her and swam through her legs. I wanted to bite into her thigh like a shark. At night, I was sleeping in a room opposite hers. Because of the heat, the window had to be open. I could have gone out into the garden, sneaked into her room. I could have knocked her out and bitten her buttocks. This picture came into my eyes so vividly, I almost went to do it. This terrible gap between fantasy and reality. But I was in my friend's house. Soon my family joined us. The last night there we had a meat dish. She's looking into the kitchen and asking, where's the meat? There it was, a large plateful. And the picture of a large, fat body stripped and put on the plate and presented on the table came into my mind. How delicious it would have been if all of us could have eaten her.
What tends to happen in all of these cases is that the person finds themselves increasingly taken over by the fantasy. The thing becomes increasingly obsessive, but it happens very slowly. It's like walking into a pond inch by inch, until it reaches the point where suddenly what began as something fairly mild is turned into something quite horrific. I think that happens fairly suddenly too. Quite suddenly, overnight almost, you've taken a decisive step in fantasy into something new and more horrible. And this really sticks with you from then on. It's like crossing a Rubicon.
My fantasies now started to involve me in secret play acting. They were starting to exist independently of my own rational being. The beast in me, because I can't think of another name for him, made me find a secret place for his rituals. My other self, my rational self, told me that if I acted them out, I might satisfy him, and he'd leave me in peace for a while. But I secretly knew as I stumbled through these mad charades that I was only increasing his appetite. But I don't want to kill. I just want to eat. My yearning and adoration for something so different from my own physique grew stronger and stronger. Originally focused on women, it was now directed towards white women exclusively. The reason it became white women is intimately tied up with Japanese history and culture. We're in a unique historical position. When the Western powers, led by Britain, were colonizing Asia, Japan was the only country spared this process. The Japanese felt they had to catch up and westernize themselves in order to avoid the threat of colonization. We became a split people, outwardly Western, inwardly still Oriental.
Western influence and ideas overwhelmed Japan after the war, and in this onslaught, they began to feel they'd lost their identity, that, in a sense, they'd become mentally colonized. Inevitably, this love affair with all things Western affected their sense of themselves, their sexual selves. Male and female role models were imported from countries thousands of miles away. In this respect, Sagawa was superficially no different from millions of other post-war Japanese, the object of his fantasies being Grace Kelly. He talks about how all her photographs seem to emphasize not just this porcelain beauty, her glowing health, her wholesomeness and poise, but also the beautiful curve of her shoulders.
I'm a weak, small, short, ugly man. I know that. That's the plain truth. But that's why my yearning for something big and wholesome was so strong. And for me that was a Western white woman, a beautiful one.
From the beginning of human history, there's always been this obsessive notion that actually eating your enemies will enable you to take on their intelligence, their strength, their beauty, and so on. And so there's a certain sense in which what Sagawa was trying to do was, in a sense, quite nuttily logical. He had this feeling that if he could somehow take into himself the woman, he would become somehow more whole, more complete. I myself feel that what you've actually got here is a total misdirection of the urge, that really what you want to take in is kind of part of her. You remember that Plato declared that originally human beings were spheres with 4 legs and 4 arms, 2 heads, and that the gods decided to slice them down the middle because they were getting above themselves, and now the 2 halves spend their lives searching for one another and don't challenge the gods anymore. Now there's something very true about this notion. There's something absolutely basic, and you can suddenly see this in someone like Sagawa, a terrific hunger, the feeling that he's not whole.
After university, I went to Paris to study for a doctorate in literature, and it was a shock. I was lonely. I had no friends and nowhere to go. One insignificant little Oriental man in a world of giants. In this beautiful city, I was suddenly surrounded by the substance of my fantasies. Whereas in Japan, there were few white women. It was rare to see one, and when you did, it was stimulating. Here, I felt overwhelmed. What was once fantasy now turned into compulsion.
I
was about to act according to a scenario I'd written myself. Sometimes people misunderstand and say it was an impulsive act and that I was sexually infatuated. But it wasn't like that. It was premeditated. Every step had been decided. Every piece of the scenario written. I remember that my father sent me a package by one of his employees. I felt I had to thank this man, so I took him for a little sightseeing and then to a Japanese restaurant for lunch. I remember it quite clearly. I sat with a sushi meal in front of me, feeling little appetite for raw meat. After all, I was thinking to myself, I'll be having the real thing soon.
It
was as if I'd had this dream for such a long time, and if I didn't act it out, I probably wouldn't have another chance to do it when I got back to Japan. Once I thought that, it became, if I don't do it today or tomorrow, then I might die without doing it. And I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I was haunted by the image of a beautiful woman, a famous American movie star I'd seen in a magazine. She'd been found dead in the back of a rented car. As I prowled the city at night, I imagined the scene, how she drugged herself with sleeping pills and, wrapped only in a blanket, had driven alone into the darkness and to her death. What if I had found her? A beautiful woman already dead and waiting for me. I imagined myself searching the cars. I see something white. I put my hand on the doorknob. To my surprise, the door was unlocked. There's a particular smell. Look, short hair. Is it a he or a she? Jean or Jean? Man or a woman? I pull back the blanket. The soft curves. Must be her breasts. Wait. Jean. Jean Seberg. I see her mouth, deep wrinkles. She looks very tired, but I recognize her. My body starts shivering. I replace the blanket. Now is my opportunity. I quietly shut the car door and go back to my flat, to the basement. I take out a supermarket trolley I've hidden there and wheel it out into the night.
Âme sensible, s'abstenir. Bernard Marchetti va en effet vous raconter cet horrible fait divers né de la découverte de valises sanglantes dans le bois de Boulogne. Il s'agissait des restes d'une jeune néerlandaise assassinée par un étudiant japonais dans des conditions, vous allez le voir, effroyables.
Cet homme est un anthropophage. Il s'appelle Issei Sagawa, japonais né à Kobe il y a 32 ans. Jeudi dernier, il a tué d'une balle dans la tête sa camarade de faculté, Renée Hartevelt, une Hollandaise de 25 ans. Puis il a dépecé le corps, l'a conservé chez lui jusqu'à samedi soir, et pendant ces 2 jours, à plusieurs reprises, il a mangé des morceaux de la chair de sa victime. Lorsque les policiers l'ont arrêté hier soir, il y en avait encore dans son réfrigérateur. Sagawa avait connu Renée Hartevelt au centre de Sancier où il étudiait la littérature comparée. Elle le considérait comme un bon camarade, mais lui était amoureux et la poursuivait de ses avances. La Hollandaise était sage. Jeudi, une fois de plus, elle a repoussé Sagawa. Il l'a tué, et c'est en voulant se débarrasser des restes de sa victime au bois de Boulogne que le Japonais a été repéré par des témoins et par le chauffeur de taxi qui l'y avait conduit. Là, en face du chalet des îles, il avait tenté de jeter ses 2 valises dans le grand lac samedi vers 20h30, mais il a été vu et les valises sanglantes sont restées sur la berge. La police a été aussitôt avertie, l'enquête a donc été courte. On l'a accueilli hier soir chez lui, rue Erlanger, dans le 16e arrondissement de Paris. Les preuves étaient accablantes. Et cette nuit, ici, au quai des Orfèvres, Sagawa a tout avoué. Et il a dit que ses désirs sexuels avaient toujours été accompagnés de pulsions anthropophagiques, mais que ces pulsions disparaissaient avec l'assouvissement de ses désirs. Alors la résistance de la pauvre Renée Hartevelt aurait donc été la cause du meurtre et de l'accomplissement horrible de ses instincts les plus sauvages.
After psychiatric tests, examining Judge Jean-Louis Brugière decided in 1983 to drop criminal charges against Sagawa on the grounds that he was in a state of dementia at the time of the murder, and he was committed to the Paul Giraud Asylum in the Paris suburb of Villejuif.
I couldn't see any of the processes. For instance, that I'd have to kill someone, nor any of the consequences, such as being removed from society. In that sense, I was insane. Well before the act, there was a piece I'd written called Point of a Gun. It was a story similar to my case, about a man killing and eating a woman. I started writing this piece, but I couldn't finish it. It was too difficult. The feeling of reality and what I wanted to do was too strong, and I couldn't sublimate it. I'm fully aware of the risk of being misunderstood, but I'll say it anyway. The curiosity of what human flesh would taste like. The flesh of a beautiful woman. Should I call it curiosity? Anyway, it was just so strong. Something that however much I thought about it, or imagined it, I thought I could never fulfill myself unless I did it. Please forgive my impertinence for writing to you all of a sudden. I am the one who, in June this year, killed a young Dutch girl and ate her flesh and was arrested.
Unlike most sensational crimes, Sagawa's real fame only began after the shock headlines. A major Japanese film company suggested to Juro Kawa, a well-known Japanese playwright, that the incident had all the makings of a box office hit.
I was in the frame of mind that the only thing I wanted to do was to die. I had no reason to live. In those circumstances, I received this letter from Juro Kawa, the famous playwright, taking an interest in my story. I was immediately attracted to the idea that this man could interpret my crime, and in some way he could turn it into a work of art.
From this emerged Kawa's novel, Letters from Sagawa, which purports to be a work of pure fiction. In 1983, it sold 320,000 copies within 1 month of its release, and won the prestigious Akutagawa Prize. The committee praised its interesting intellectual approach. In September of the same year, Sagawa's book, In the Fog, was published, according to him, without his permission. It quickly sold 200,000 copies, but disappeared from the bookshelves when his father demanded that the publishing companies stop printing. His father did, however, accept the royalties.
About my crime? Well, some people have said I did it so that I'd have something to write about. Of course, that's not true. But I can see why some people might think that, because I started writing just after the crime. I was writing for myself, but I was still writing. Also, I'd rehearsed the crime so many, many times before committing it. It was very similar in my mind to writing a script. It happened to be me acting it out. If it had been somebody else acting in my script, it could have been a work of art. The borderline is very thin. Or should I say the curtain between fact and fiction is very thin.
C'est à bord du vol régulier d'Air France vers Tokyo que le japonais cannibale, comme on l'appelle, a quitté Paris ce matin, 3 ans après son crime horrible.
Sagawa's return to Japan turned into a media event. After all, he was a best-selling author, also happened to be a cannibal. The tabloids were ecstatic. The Japanese authorities had promised the French government that Sagawa would receive psychiatric treatment. So he was placed in Matsuzawa Hospital, the best-known treatment center in Japan. But even though he was placed in the secure unit, they had to black out his windows to thwart the prying lenses of the media. Sagawa was examined by psychiatrists. They soon decided that as the incident was 3 years ago, the urge had deserted him. Also, experts in Japan have rather different definitions of mental illness than their counterparts in France. The Japanese decided that Sagawa was no longer a danger to society.
They then decided to move me from the secure unit to the open ward. And soon after I moved there, the mass media started coming again. They sometimes took me out of the hospital to a nearby park to interview and photograph me. That really annoyed the hospital. The superintendent was outraged by the attention I was getting. I was seen as a troublemaker, and the hospital wanted to get rid of me as soon as they could. So, after 1 year and 3 months, I was discharged, a free man. And then the media started coming round and hanging about my parents' house. All day and every day. And the doorbell never stopped ringing. So I couldn't stay there, and I left Tokyo. Went into hiding in the countryside. I was lent an apartment and lived alone. A friend of my parents lived nearby and looked after me. But still the mass media found me, so I couldn't stay there either. At that time, there was a serial paedophile killer who'd been arrested, and the media came to ask me for my comments. Of course, I could have refused to cooperate and remained silent, but at the same time, an image of myself was being created by the media, and I was tired of being written about and talked about without having any say myself in this image creation. To me, this crime, which reminded people of my own crime, was like fate. It was my opportunity. So I started giving my own comments to all the people who came up to me. These comments were quite widely reported, and some critics praised my writing. So I became a writer.
彼が最初に登場したのが幼女殺害事件のコメントを喋るっていうあれだったんだけども、あれは極めて象徴的なことで、要するにマスコミが彼の商品価値っていうかね、そのどういう役柄を担わせようとしてるのかっていうのはかなり明確なんですよね。で、彼は明確であるにもかかわらず、それを利用して自分の思っていることを言おうっていうんであえて応じたわけだけども、だからそこのところそのマスコミの意図っていうのをきちんと踏まえていないと非常に危険なところへ逆に転がっていく可能性あるんだよね。
1990年11月5日、新宿の小劇場タイニーアルフ。ここで佐川さんをゲストの一人に迎えてクレイジーサラダというイベントが行われた。 このイベントはジョークを売るというテーマで漫才師、ミュージシャンなどさまざまなジャンルの人たちが集まるライブショーである。
ちょっと大きくなりましたけど。それとですね、今日ね、佐川さんの3分のね、
司会をしているのはこの企画の主催者神津慎太郎さん。佐川さんの出演もジョークの一つであるという。
僕の場合あれほど世間を騒がせて人間がこうして自由の身になって
佐川さんにとってこの出演は事件を失った社会とのコミュニケーションを自ら回復しようとする活動の一つである。
でまた今の人々だけでなくてこれから将来の人々にとって何らかのもし参考になればと思って本を書いています。
いわゆるああいった事件を起こされた方が出て、まあ公の場に出てきて喋るということには違和感なり抵抗なりは感じられませんでしたか？
違和感だらけですよ。
具体的にどんな感じ？
しかしあれ許されているのかなと思ってね。僕だったら絶対許せないけどね。
なんていうかな、そういう犯罪現場にいた人がこの同じ空間にいるっていう一種のなんかやっぱり日常にはないものですよね、私たちの生活の中では。だからそういうものに対するこう戸惑いみたいな部分かな、まだなんかピタッとこういかないみたいな、そういうものかなと思います。
ここに大きな一つの皮肉があるんですね。つまり、事件を起こす。
There's a big irony here because before the crime I was a dangerous person. I know that.
しかし事件を一回起こしてしまって。
But once I'd done it, it shattered my fantasy and exposed my innermost self to the outside world.
全て知られることによって自分が限りなく
I became empty. Now when people call me a monster, or as they say in France, the incredible demon, it's ironical.
そういう言葉で呼ばれるということは非常になんというか皮肉だというふうに思います。
Because for me now, doing something similar is unthinkable.
問題外でそれほどエネルギーもありませんし。
Once I'd acted out my fantasy, that was the end of it.
だから僕自身が言うのもあれですけど、今の自分は本当に
It's so strange to say.
生きる屍みたいな。
I feel like a zombie. I'm a sort of shell.
無害なものなんですけども。
John Cooper Powys has an interesting example in this novel, The Glastonbury Romance, where Mr. Evans, who's based upon himself, is obsessed by a book he keeps in his basement called The Unforgivable Sin. And what he finds so fascinating about this book is a particular passage about a killing blow with an iron bar, which he has to go back to again and again. And at the end of the novel, when Mr. Evans knows that someone is about to commit a similar crime, he doesn't blow the whistle because he wants to see it. Then when actually he sees a man's skull split open by an iron bar, he vomits, and from then on is so shattered that he becomes relatively a kind of empty shell. In a sense, Mr. Hyde has gone and left him a mere fraction of himself.
I have to look at the images created of me and then at my own sense of myself. And I stand in this gap, sometimes moving towards that image created by society. I don't want to trade on the incident, but I can't bury it. If I tried to deny it, then I wouldn't know myself. In order to face myself, I have to live with it and not deny it happened.
The act of murder defines a person in a way that no other act does. Almost anything else, you can outgrow it. You can say, man is basically free, and I have the ability to turn away completely from this and do something creative, which will, in a sense, wash my soul free of this. With the act of murder, this is almost impossible, unless the crime is so unpremeditated, you can say, this wasn't really me who did it. In Sagawa's case, he accepts the guilt so completely that I can't ever see him being able to turn away from it, to leave it behind.
What I really want to know is where this fantasy of cannibalism came from. I understand that I lived a nightmare. I remember the incidents, but I still don't know why. Until I understand that, I can't understand myself. I can't discover my own identity, and that's terribly important. Also, I like to talk to other people about it. I know that's important for me too. And writing, but writing is only talking to myself.
ここで佐川君を料理する会という座談会が開かれた。
質問になるということなので、そういうことが本当にすべきなことなのかどうかというのははっきり言って僕は自分で回答を得ていないんです。確信を持ってこの時に来たわけじゃなくて、なんかおっかなびっくりというか及び腰できてるところはあります。それは正直にあります。わざわざ来ていただいた皆さんの前でこんなこと言うのは失礼かもしれないんですけれども、ある部分では本当にこんなことしてていいんだろうかなという気持ちはあります。
やっぱりね、そのタレントとして生きていく道に、
主催はクレイジーサラダの高津さん。佐川さんの本の出版を記念して企画されたものである。
ちょっとこうなんかできるような形になっていかないと、テレビは VTR 出演しか難しい、生は難しいんじゃないかってご本人前だけど、僕は今思ってます、現在だと。
やっぱ視聴率は取れますよ。
ただね、
そう、もちろんそれは
この日集まった20人ほどの客はほとんどが招待客であり、マスコミ関係者が多かった。
まあまあそういうことや。
佐川さんの社会的貢献、作家としての今後についてさまざまな意見が交わされた。
じゃあアンケートをお書きになりましたら、
一つの自己確認というのか、あるいは事件をもう一度
Writing is a kind of self-confirmation, or a confirmation of the event and a re-experiencing of it.
である自分自身にとっても事件がどんなものであったか。
Because for me, the event is still very obscure.
本当にこれは文字通りなんですけど、夢の中で
Literally, I felt I did it in a dream.
ですからそれを確認したかったんです。一つ一つの事実。
So I need to confirm it again and again.
で、どういう状況に
Go through the factors, one by
と
one,
いうことを文字を続け
and write them all down.
確認したかったということです。
笑い定めく人の声が耳の表をかすめています。このまま眠ってしまえたら。
The noise of people's laughter haunts me. If only I could fall asleep. After a while I look round in a haze. Then that noise comes again. The naked legs of young women pass through my mind. I look at the suitcase. There are legs inside there as well. Legs on the move. Legs which cannot move. Warm legs. And legs that are cold and still.
Did it please you?
Very much. Too much.
Better than yesterday?
No comparison. I got to choose all the best parts. And you were salty enough. Delicious. What do you think?
We've discovered something new.
What?
Oh, please. So in conclusion, you like me so much that you'd like to eat me up, and I...
Issei Sagawa, watching a film version of one of his own fantasies, is to understand something rather disturbing about human beings. The essence of pornography is that it has very little connection with reality. And Sagawa committed this crime out of an obsession that also had very little connection with reality.
A mental freak like myself becomes public property. I deserve it, I suppose. But sometimes I feel that really my sole purpose for existing is to feed a public appetite, their appetite for transgression. And then there's me, Sagawa the man, and the press's fascination with my private life. Do they or don't they know? How does he behave? Is he normal now? And yes, there are times when I collude, when I play Sagawa the cannibal.
After seeing himself depicted by other people, the next step for Sagawa was to start making his own appearances on television shows and adult videos.
With a model thoughtfully provided by a French magazine, I was asked to paint an erotic picture whilst they interviewed me. A few weeks later, I received a copy of the article. Someone had added a knife and fork to the bottom left-hand corner of my painting. I must have been about 12 or 13 when I first heard of the Yellow Peril. Our teacher told us of an Austrian emperor who dreamed a nightmare of Asiatic hordes closing in on Europe. The wily, inscrutable Oriental. The face that betrays so little. The maker wrapped us in a tighter envelope. But underneath this expressionless mask, we are predatory people. We are patient, watchful, good at camouflaging our intentions, like all successful predators. Yet our prey has a curious characteristic. It seeps into our psyche. It turns us into itself. In our dreams, in our fantasy life, we imagine ourselves white. The very people we thought we were exploiting have colonized our souls. Their features advertised as barber shop. Sell us our clothes, even our own cars. And people, all our comic book fantasies. Millions of them produced every year. Wide-eyed Amazonian white women live out these comic strip lives in a world full of extremes of violence and sex. And even our romances are played out by white couples. Occasionally, our cartoonists exploit our inherent masochism in this world of the dominant culture. We become mere furniture in the lives of these superwomen. To be skied on, sat on, driven, put on a leash and walked around like a dog. The ever-present Japanese fantasy of the huge white female dominatrix. The Japanese have unconsciously suffered from this schizophrenia. An envy of white culture, but at the same time despising it. And this mixed up together with a genuine inferiority complex. In a sense, I'm the most extreme example of that. And a love-hate relationship is complicated. Because my fantasy is not just a yearning for whiteness, but an intense frustration because I can't be white. And at the same time, I can't free myself from the obsession. And quite honestly, it's not adoration, but something very complicated, and in a sense, grotesque. I wanted to be white. Or that's to say, I wanted to possess the quality of a white woman. I wanted to feel the existence of a white woman in the strongest and most intimate way. That desire, that compulsion led me to eating. For me, eating is an extension of seeing someone I like, of touching someone I like, and smelling someone I like, and kissing someone I like. For me, eating is to fulfill the hunger for existence. What I mean is, because of this desire for something unattainable, I like to see, I like to feel, I like to kiss, and then I like to eat. It's an extension of the others. So for me, eating was not a particularly extreme action.
In his last book, there's a curious scene of fantasy in which he imagines himself returning into his mother's womb, becoming invisible, leaving it all behind him. Clearly, there's a sense in which he feels this is the only answer to begin all over again.
Imprinted on my retina was an image, soft and pink. What was it? It wasn't blood. Blood's red. Then my mother's temple twitched. That was meat. She puts her hands on the sheet. She feels her stomach. It feels smaller now. Far away from her protective wing, in a solitary cell in a foreign country, I curl up, head tightly against my knees, short arms and legs, stick-like, drawn into a crouch of the dead. I curl up into invisibility. I've lost something together with that pink object, and what I've lost has created an emptiness around me. I push my knees against my jaw. I clasp myself and whisper, "That's enough." I don't want to see anymore. I don't want to feel anymore. I don't want to be anymore. I'm a fetus. I'm invisible.